Let's hold on. All right. Ariella, would you be willing to read our text, please?
Certainly. Rabbi Tarfon said, "The day is short and the work is plentiful, and the laborers are indolent and the reward is great, and the master of the house is insistent." Biography. Rabbi Tarfon, who lived at the same time as the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, lived in Lydda. He both taught with Rabbi Akiva. While they disagreed frequently, it is said that they were still great friends and still friends and allies. Given all this, he was active as a rabbi from around 80 to 135 CE. He is mentioned in the Haggadah as having stayed up all night with Rabbi Akiva and 3 others discussing the Exodus. Modern scholars think that these rabbis were planning during the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and that the student who came to say that it was time for the morning Shema was really a lookout. Rabbi Tarfon was very conscious of the commandment to honor your parents, and he let his mother climb into and out of her bed by climbing on his back, Kiddushin 31b. He owned vineyards as well as taught Torah. Rabbi Tarfon was a priest, and thus he was able to eat truma, tithes of food that were given to priests. Once there was a famine, and Rabbi Tarfon married 300 women so they could eat truma. Tosefta Ketubot 5:1. How are these sayings relevant to our lives today?
Thank you.
How do you support 300 women?
There may have been some specific details written into the ketubah as to what exactly his obligations were.
Seems to me that there's a discrepancy or a dichotomy, I guess, between laborers being indolent and the reward being great. As if they didn't realize how great the reward was if they're actually being indolent. Seems rather strange.
Well, whose reward is it? You know, is the reward for the overseer, or is the reward for the laborers themselves?
Good point.
So is this a description of those who don't pursue Torah and Haftarah carefully, that our time is short, there's much to be done in learning, we're not as active as we should be in pursuing it, but if we did pursue it, the reward would be great, and God is insistent that we should pursue it? I mean, is this really a metaphor for that?
Definitely.
I'm sorry,
It could be. There's no context given on this one. It is entirely up to interpretation. So
I gave my interpretation then.
very good.
And I think of myself as the lazy worker. But it's me. I'm the laborer. My reward is great, and the master is insistent that we must do this.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's so we are lazy.
Maybe this is a funny question, but I'm just wondering, why is it 2:15, but some say 2:20? What?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are 2 different ways of dividing up Pirkei Avot. Chapter 1, everybody agrees on like how the division breaks out. Chapter 2, starting in chapter 2, some people combine certain ones and other people say that they ought to be separate. So in an attempt to make this source sheet as useful as possible to anybody who stumbles upon it, I put in that some say 220. I discovered this was an issue when I found a reference with one citation, and I looked it up in somewhere else, and like it did not at all match what I was looking for. And I was very confused, and eventually I figured out that there are these 2 different systems.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question.
getting back to the other Allen's metaphor, the fact that, and I don't know, Alan, if you said this and I missed it, but the fact that master is capitalized, at least in the English translation, usually you don't see those, you don't see things like that capitalized unless it's referring to God.
And that's what I was saying. And
Okay. I
God,
missed
and
the
the
part
God,
about the
and God is
capitalization.
insistent that the reward is great to study the Torah and have, his teachings, and he's insistent we do it. But our reward would be great if we did. But
I can agree with that interpretation, but who knows if this grammatic, this was someone that was inferred by the person doing the translating, he thought the same way and just capitalized it, or was it capitalized in some way, emphasized or emphatic in Hebrew, that it was indeed capital and was referring to the master rather than a master.
So I'll bring up the Hebrew for those that might help. There are no capital letters in Hebrew. Hebrew has it backwards and has different forms at the end of the word for a few letters. So I would suggest, for our exploration purposes, that we play it out two different ways. What does it mean / how is it relevant to our lives today if the master is capitalized? And what does it mean, how is it relevant to our lives if the master is not capitalized?
Well, I think whenever the master is capitalized, it falls under Allen's, interpretation very well. And then I think it goes into a more literal whenever the master is not capitalized for modern interpretation, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
I agree, Justin, and I'd say there's great opportunity if the master is not capitalized, or if it's not a metaphor, whatever, for God. But just then the concept is there's pressure to get work done, and the master needs it done. So your reward will be great because the people who are working on it aren't so motivated. But that's a more opportunistic sort of interpretation of the passage. So one's more spiritual, one more opportunistic.
So something else I'm kind of picking up a little bit is you can either read it where it's almost completely negative or it's completely positive, except for the two center ones, like where the day is too short, the work is too much, the laborers are lazy, but the reward is still great. That one cannot almost be negative. Like that one's almost always a positive. And then conversely, you can also read it where everything's positive. The day's short, you don't have to put up with that long. There's plenty of work, but the laborers are lazy. That one's kind of hard to make it positive. I was just kind of trying to, do a exercise of reading it in two different mindsets and that's what was popping up on me.
Well, and if it's not capitalized and the laborers are indolent and the master's insistent because the reward is great and they're not producing because the reward goes to the master rather than the workers, then you might understand why the master, lowercase, isn't being insistent because his reward isn't as if they're not working, the reward will not be the same, it won't be as large. My whole point before was that just by someone who's ever doing the translation was imposing almost his particular interpretation by capitalizing master. He was in creating a bias. You know, he had to me, it would reflect a bias in what this particular person was thinking. But that may be what was generally accepted in the discussions in Hebrew, and that's unfortunately I'm my understanding reading a Hebrew is meager, so I have to be satisfied with the English.
Do you know what? Do you know who translated?
Except we know that these are scholars who are talking about how people should be studying Torah. So I think it has to be. I would say that this translation is what was meant, that the master is God, and that we are the laborers. The day is short, our lives are short. There's a lot to accomplish. We've got to study. I have to think that's what they're talking about.
But the rabbi also was a vineyard owner as well. So, I mean, this could have been what he told all of the laborers out there picking grapes at the vineyard too, was, you know, coming from that angle.
David, is this somewhat out of context that if you brought in the verse before this, it might give some clarification?
Maybe. Let's look. So our previous one was from a different rabbi, and it does talk about toil and that your employer can be relied upon to reward your labor.
It also says be diligent in the study of Torah.
Ah, that's true. It does. So if you read this as a complete set, a complete saying where all the parts work together, then toil and labor presumably work with the study of Torah. Or go with the study of Torah. If you read them as separate pieces, then again, we have the bias of the capitalization in English.
And here you have whom and employer being capitalized, which implies they're both referring to the Lord.
Yeah. Presumably, Rabbi Judah Hanassi, who organized these sayings along with the rest of the Mishnah, he had a whole set of sayings that he wanted to include, and then he had to figure out what order to put them in and which went in which chapters and how to arrange them in the chapters. So presumably he noticed a theme by putting these two next to each other.
There are several translations that are available to me, just in my own library, of this vote, in most of them. In fact, I think almost every single one of them is putting the capitalization in such a way that it's clear that God is the actor, the employer, the master. Capital in the English translations, they are very consistently capitalized.
That's interesting.
Section.
Sorry.
No, I was just saying for this entire section, they are a unit, and it's very consistent. I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Alan?
No, I looked up in Lev Shalem, and all of them are lowercase. Consistently. but I didn't want to bring it up because I didn't want to derail the interesting conversation that we were having. So there really doesn't seem to be agreement among, translators or the editors in terms of whether it should or shouldn't be capitalized.
So Neil, do the translations you have in your library all stem from more modern times rather than some medieval times, if you will? Was the capitalization something more recent, or has it been there all along?
Most of my library is 20th century, so I don't have. I have some 19th century stuff, but it doesn't include Pirkei Avot. And I don't have anything further back. If I did, I'd be a very wealthy cantor.
David said you were. Knowledge, nothing else.
Aw, thank you.
Herb, are you implying that the Middle Ages was like 20th century?
No, I'm implying the Middle Ages were back around, the 12th to 15th century,
Oh, okay.
if you will.
All right. I just wanted to clarify.
And I'm not sure if the English language back before then really capitalized the English words to refer to God or not.
No.
How far back do the English translations go?
They don't go back to Shakespearean times. That I can say with some degree of certainty. Maybe to the 18th century, but I would be very shocked if there's English translations before the 18th century.
Wouldn't there have been English translation at the time of the Pilgrims? Certainly
for Pirkei Avot?
There have been more like Germanic translations around that time.
Yeah.
Not sure.
Yeah. There may have been some, because of the Enlightenment, there may have been some Germanic translations in the 19th century, but I don't know that anybody would have been doing Pirkei Avot. Jews would have been doing it.
There would have been English translations of what they call the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Torah. And I wonder if they would have capitalized the words in the Torah in the English translations.
That I've never seen one of those
Either have I.
English Bibles. But I will tell you that until the 19th century, all study like this was done strictly in Hebrew.
Could it be that it's capitalized because the master is known? In today's writing, you would only capitalize a title if it was speaking of a particular person.
So, Steve, it sounds like you're suggesting that just like you would capitalize for a specific person, then if you knew like that this is a specific master, like a proper noun, I guess, as a
Yeah. If you were to say President Biden, president would be capitalized, but if you just said president, it would be lowercase.
If you were talking about the Lord of the Manor, you might capitalize both the words Lord and Manor, knowing you'd be talking about a human being and not necessarily God.
Jordy?
So I've done a little poking around on Safaria, and they have a whole slew of commentaries, most of which are not in English. It seems that at least of the ones that are in English, they don't focus too much on who the master is, perhaps because they all assume they know who the master is. But for instance, Rambam, Maimonides, who lived in the 1000s, explains this text as saying, "This is a metaphor for the brevity of years and the multitude of wisdoms and the laziness of men to seek it, in spite of the great reward for them and the multitude of notices in the Torah and its warnings to seek wisdom and study," based off of a verse in Joshua that all the commentaries like to quote about on this one about you shall meditate on it day and night, which the rabbis took to mean Torah. So 1,000 years ago, that was Maimonides' interpretation of this, and he's certainly entitled to his opinion. The question for us remains, how is this relevant to our lives today?
Day is short and the work is plentiful. Talking about Torah would imply that you can't really take any time off because you'll never finish it. Yet, even in Rabbi Tarfon's day, rabbis had employment outside of Torah study. So there seems to be a conflict there between being able to earn a living and being able to finish the study of Torah, if there is any such thing as finishing it is concerned.
Yeah, they actually had a discussion in during the time of the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said that rabbis who had other employments, I don't remember exactly what he said, but he thought this was a bad idea, and he was outnumbered by his colleagues, who said something to the effect of like, if you only are stuck in the ivory tower, then you can't bring life into Torah and you can't fully understand it.
Perhaps worse, you can't bring Torah into life.
Yes, also true.
Good advice for politicians.
No comment.
Well, and I'm not saying for what party, but just anybody who has to relate to folks, anything, even if it's in any environment. Let's not use politicians. Just anybody who's working in my profession, engineering. Someone who sits in the office all day, never gets out in the field and sees how you have to do something. I would suggest it's not going to be know how to design as well, or design something that's easily executable and less and that will be more economical.
I'd like to get
the stories about that. So
I'd like to get the engineer who designed the instructions for putting a bicycle together and never did it, and came to my house and put the bicycle together that he designed. Parts don't seem to fit quite the same way he described.
Yeah. Yeah. So you could say it doesn't apply to almost any aspect of our lives if you want. How does it apply today? I know I always never get everything finished I want to get finished, but sometimes I'm indolent and I'll get off and sidetracked into something else that might it distracts me, but I'm enjoying it. You know, yesterday I went off and was studying something that had nothing to do with the tasks and the chores I had to that were more immediate. So my day was short and my reward wasn't as great because I didn't do everything I was supposed to, and it's still there. So it's insistent, or my wife will tell me, "You didn't do this yet, dear." So I even tell myself that you didn't take care of it. You should have. So that's my way of applying it to the present day, or any other obligations I have. Even doing some charity work or something else, or just helping somebody else, it's easy to put off, or not make a phone call to a friend I haven't visited in a while.
And I keep coming back to that. The laborers are indolent. And whether it's talking about laborers or talking about people and their relationship to God, I just feel like it's just such a condescending attitude. It's like the rabbi or rabbis saying, you know, we're up here and everybody else is down there and they're never going to be as good. So, you know, what the heck? You know, we'll just forget about them. And, you know, the same can be said about a lot of workplaces. You know, the bosses have a terrible view of their workers and treat them as such.
Well, it's like all the companies in, you know, Texas and Kentucky that are being like, well, the workers are just lazy. They don't want to go back to work. And they're finding out it's because they don't want to go back to a job that only pays like $20,000 a year. You know, I mean, they're saying, oh, these workers are lazy. You know, like you said, Alan, it's a little condescending, you know.
Using a yes and approach, what if the rabbis view themselves that they were the laborers? If the work is Torah.
Work the study of Torah, or is work the teaching of Torah?
Let's go with the study of Torah for this interpretation.
What's the reward?
Knowledge, understanding, being closer to the master.
That's sufficient. Or be better if they were teaching Torah, saw their students learning Torah, perhaps learning it better than they would if they had to do it on their own.
David, could you scroll down to the context?
Yep. So he was a student, he was a teacher. He was focused on honoring your parents. He was a priest. And he was a inventor.
If this is, I think it was Herb who said that, you know, you could look at it and say this was about the rabbis and maybe they were indolent. Well, you know, if in this case, Rabbi Tarfon was a priest and he benefited from the labors of everybody in the community who gave their tithes of food. So if you are talking about studying, if he didn't study, then he really wasn't holding up his end of the bargain. But all those people who were working hard and tithing, you know, were supporting him. So in that case, yeah, he could be critical of the other rabbis or priests for being indolent.
Rabbi Tarfon was studying Torah and not teaching it, not conveying Torah to the people. How do they know that he was actually doing anything?
Well,
He
it's
was
like,
actually studying, that he was actually learning.
well, it's 2,000 years later and we're still learning about him. I think that he's probably teaching some stuff if we're still, if he's still on our lips right now.
We know that he was a teacher of Rabbi Akiva. So we did at least, and a student of Rabbi, actually, I'm not sure that he was a student of Rabbi Yochanan. He was a student of somebody. He wasn't born knowing this stuff. So presumably he taught other people besides Rabbi Akiva. That being said, your point still stands, Herb, about from the people's perspective, how do they know what's going on in the world of the yeshiva, where people are studying and teaching together?
Maybe that something to be said about looking at the people in Israel who just want to study Torah and not take part in any of the daily life, if you will, but have state support them in doing what they're doing. Are they really teaching to others, or are they just studying for their own benefit, whatever that benefit may be? I'm not criticizing, I'm asking.
Yeah, I think they would say that they believe that their study spiritually sustains the country. Like, I think that they are contributing to the greater society.
And I think in Tarfon's case, at least in the biography, it talks about how he was planning a rebellion and also trying to support, widows and, something throughout his community. So I'd say he's, at least from the biography standpoint, it sounds like he's, studying, living the Torah and trying to, do good in his community.
And he learned that from studying Torah.
Day is short.
So something I've been wondering about this text since I've been looking at it with all of you this evening is the relationship between the laborers are indolent and the reward is great. I'm wondering, perhaps the reward isn't the right reward, and that's why the laborers are indolent. Perhaps the reward is great because otherwise the laborers would be more indolent. Like, I don't know. But I'm wondering about the relationship between these two pieces of the text.
Like, are you thinking that the reward is like already so good, being close to the master and whatnot, that like, regardless of what the laborers do, they are almost undeserving of the reward? Is that what you're saying? The laborers can't possibly do the work required to get the reward. That's why they're not considered, or they're lazy. Is that what you're?
Or that they, it's the wrong reward. Like if the reward was the one that the laborers actually wanted, they would be less indolent.
I looked up
I don't think one would then say that that Rabbi Tarfon would then say the reward is great. It's rather, I think, that the laborers fail to see the value of that reward, or don't have the willingness to overcome the difficulty in exchange to getting the reward. But I don't think that it's implying that the reward, it's an interpretation, I appreciate it, but I don't know that I take away that the reward is the wrong reward from how this is structured. I didn't take away that it's more for one reason or another. It's either too many laborers want something immediate and material, and this is more abstract and long-term, or it takes much too much work to get the reward, and so they're not willing to put in the hard work. I'm sorry, Herb.
And maybe the laborers think they have enough as it is, even though the reward may be great. And I've had that experience where, well, and not necessarily in this society, but in other parts of the world, where I say, oh, let's get in, I get some work done, and we'll have to work a little bit later today, and why wouldn't you want some overtime? And say, no, I've got enough for now. I don't need any more. I'm happy.
I looked up the word indolent, and from the Oxford Languages, it says it's wanting to avoid activity or exertion, being lazy, but they quote, they were indolent and addicted to a life of pleasure. Seems to me that a life of pleasure isn't being lazy, it's just a life different from the life of the laborer, if you will.
Well, that's what I'm trying to point out. Sometimes it has to do with a different perspective or a different cultural view of things. And so no matter how great the reward is in material or monetary things, maybe the folks, certain people just don't find that attractive to them, or it compensates maybe being indolent and in a certain sense enjoying something else other than study, or in this case, or working hard to produce something. The priorities are different.
It's somebody who does a triathlon would say the reward is great. I think not most people choose not to put in that type of work to get to that reward. So that's a sort of more physical, whether we call ourselves indolent or just reasonable by not wanting to do a triathlon. It's a different discussion, but I think, here, I still find the most compelling this definition discussion is that the reward is closeness, getting closer to an understanding of God and godliness. And that's an abstract concept for most people, not of the material world. And that's why most people are indolent, because they don't see that reward, indolent in that regard, not necessarily lazy.
As I'm listening to all of this, I'm noticing that in the last sentence, the master of our house is insistent, but it doesn't list any kind of punishment, or if you don't, then this happens to you, which often we see in some of our liturgy. Rain in the proper season and all of those things you do as I say. So it doesn't give the laborers that extra push, like you'll lose your job, or you're, like if you want to talk about today's world, you either do the work or someone else will do it, and you're out of there. So I don't see I don't see that sense of things there, that it makes it more important for the laborers because they're not really worried about the reward maybe, and they're also not worried about any kind of punishment if they choose to be lazy, or any consequence. Maybe punishment's the wrong word, but any kind of a negative consequence. It's my 2 cents.
I would suggest that just getting back to the text itself, that the reward they're talking about is in the world to come. It's often spoken of that way, I think, in the Torah.
Torah doesn't really talk about the world to come. That's something that the rabbis brought up.
Yeah.
Nothing of an afterlife in the 5 books of Moses.
Yes, and now that we're in the world of Pirkei Avot, we're one away from finishing chapter 2. there is talk of the world to come. I want to say Rabbi Akiva talked about later on about this world as an entryway into the world to come or something like that.
Mhm.
So if Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva talked with each other, which it seems that they would have, they may have been, Rabbi Tarfon could have been thinking about the world to come, or not. You could take it either way. So what I'm taking away from this, or one of the thoughts that I've had from what you guys have been saying about the laborers are indolent, and thinking about how that's relevant today is like, if the reward is great and yet the laborers are still indolent, maybe one needs to ask the laborers what would be sufficiently motivating, because clearly the reward is not cutting it. And if the laborer is ourself, then maybe the reward for indolence is sometimes and distraction or whatever is greater than the reward for doing what we ought to be doing. And maybe it's about finding other ways to motivate ourselves. But this text seems highly relevant today.
David, take a 20-year-old who goes to work, gets a job, and is told that they're going to take part of his salary and apply it to a fund that will give him a pension when he's 65 and retires. And his comment is that I want to enjoy the money now. And how do I know that I will live to see that world to come at the age of 65? So yes, the reward in the world to come is a hope, but do you know for certain that I will see something at the time?
Like, I think Carol and Doris's kind of go hand in hand ideas, in that like Carol's is one, there's not necessarily a punishment or whatnot, and Doris it's more abstract in that, kind of like what Herb was saying, which, it's abstract, it's in the future, it's, something kind of like that, like you were saying. So I think everybody's kind of hitting the same points quite well.
Right. I'd like to, with apologies to the fact that next week at this time I will be traveling to where I used to live to start the process of recovering the end of my storage there and bring it back to where I'm currently living and plan on staying. I just want to point out that the edition of Pirkei Avot I am looking at deals with what David taught us before about why there's different numbering systems by actually pairing some of them. And I would like to just leave you all, from my perspective, with thought much of what has been discussed here tonight will actually, I think, find some resolution in what in the edition I happen to be looking at right now is chapter 2, parak number 21. And I won't spoil the upcoming discussion by letting you all know what's in there, but I'm just looking ahead at it because it's in my edition literally right next to it. or right after it, and all sorts of the issues that you all have been chewing on are more or less directly addressed in the next part of what Rabbi Tarfon is going to be saying next week.
So
So
tune
we're
in.
left with a cliffhanger.
Yeah. And David, since I won't be around to offer to sing it next week, can I at least sing the song that is part of next week's Barak? Or did you
I'll
want
let you sing it because we'll be doing it in 2 weeks, actually.
Oh, it's 2
2 weeks. You won't miss it. But stay tuned, everybody. I'm going to stop the share now and the recording.